that illustrate areas where upwards of 90% of the people are of one skin color. Housing discrimination in the U.S. is systemic through disparate treatment, disparate impact, and disguised animus. It is very hard for most people to discern. As such, raising awareness of this issue will require conscious effort and extraordinary vigilance. In a society that claims to be post-racial, there is a systematic effort to hide such illegal behavior. This paper is about understanding segregation and its impact on where people live. Or to put it another way, how discriminatory practices in the housing industry lead to people living in segregated neighborhoods. I very briefly illuminate and expose the convoluted nature of housing segregation by noting that legislative action intended to be solutions to segregation, such as the Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights Act, have in fact been incredibly ineffective in changing the lived reality for many. There are numerous scenarios where interest groups, both formal and informal, have vested interest in keeping our society racially segregated. These include housing codes and their enforcement, environmental racism, waging the war on drugs in hidden ghettos, and real estate steering and other practices. I propose to lay out discussions of two exemplars, sundown town and redlining, with a particular interest in clearly understanding redlining. Understanding the difference between desegregation and integration is fundamentally important if we are to unpack the convoluted nature of housing discrimination. America in 2015 does not live in a desegregated housing environment, much less an integrated one. The issue of housing discrimination is an example that opens up conversation around attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. History illustrates a long-term pattern of segregated housing with neighborhoods stratified by race along with other factors. These discursive practices have fostered ways of thinking and acting in the world, and the notion that this is the way things are has led to a hardening of racial attitudes. The domain of urban studies looks at our social construction of cities, towns, and metropolitan areas that sheds light on understanding the evolution of residential patterns, showing that creating beloved community is a challenging proposition. In addition to the problem of actual housing discrimination, there is the problem of a lack of awareness or discussion that keeps the subject of racist housing practices hidden from view. My research explores the attitudes of racism manifested through real estate discrimination as it has been organized formally by federal, state, and local governments, and through informal networks of mortgage and real estate professionals in the United States. The need for awareness and discussion is critically important before an attempt is made to address such practices which continue to the present day, as explicated by Pulido, who says, quote, "Race exists in various realms. Racial meanings are embedded in our language, psyche, and social structures." Sundown towns and redlining. Sundown towns and redlining are concrete examples of segregation that are not well known among the general public. These tend to elicit a reaction of disbelief with an exclamation of, "That really happens?" Acknowledging these helps us to understand the importance of seeing the nuances of this issue. Many activists working for integrated housing see fair housing as the last major frontier, the last plank, so to speak. Real estate sales and rental agents continue the practice of directing or steering Hispanic and African American home seekers to places where they can, quote, find housing. Perry asserts, quote, maintaining the whiteness of communities is of economic benefit to realtors who want to maximize their commission and reputation. Perry, page 167. In spite of the popular notion that we live in a post-racial society, it is without a doubt critical to develop a clear understanding of the mechanisms of discriminatory forces, such as sundown towns, redlining, liquor lining, exclusionary zoning, and similar practices that are deeply embedded into the American landscape. There are many examples of practices that add to this challenge, one of which is the sundown town. James Lowen, a sociologist who has done much pioneering research on this topic, did not even begin his study of these towns until 2001. A sundown town is defined as, quote, any organized jurisdiction that for decades kept African Americans or other groups from living in it and was thus all white on purpose. The sundown town shows pervasive resistance to any integration of public life, particularly housing. This has been true especially since the enactment of the Fair Housing Act, and relates not only to the application of the rule of law, but to informal mechanisms of control. It is here that the signs at the county or city line tell the entire story. N-word. Don't let the sun go down on you in name of town. To this day, many of these sundown towns are still in excess of 90% white, despite the fact that the practices are illegal. I argue that redlining is an example of the economic production of race. Homer Hoyt, chief economist for the Federal Housing Administration, developed redlining in 1934 in order to improve the accuracy of real estate appraisal and standardize the practice of mortgage lending to avoid undue risk. He ranked various races and nationalities by order of, quote, desirability as follows. Most desired were the old American stock of Anglo-Saxons and Northern Europeans, English, German, Scots, Irish, and Scandinavians, followed by Northern Italians, Czechoslovakian, Polish, Greeks, Russian Jews of the lower class, South Indian, and at the bottom of the list, Negroes and Mexicans. He further developed a scheme by assigning color codes to his hierarchy. Green was white, affluent, Anglo-Saxon, and appropriately Protestant. Blue was less desirable whites, Jews, Irish, and Italians. Yellow was undesirable working class whites. Red was black or brown or Mexican, regardless of wealth or class. Imani Perry, Princeton University professor of African American Studies, suggests, quote, the signature social history for understanding this phenomenon is the history of the Federal Housing Authority in the mid-20th century. Through the practices of redlining and subsidizing wealth creation for white Americans via mortgage policy, the FHA institutionalized the racialization of real property. White Americans are able to enhance their position in society through appreciation in the value of real property that can then be passed on to future generations through mechanisms of inheritance. American history is filled with examples of families who have been on the same piece of land for generations, while the property continually appreciated in value. In an article dated May 28, 2015, Emily Badger of the Washington Post highlights the problem by observing the following, quote, "If your family was denied a mortgage in the 1930s, the 1950s, or the 1970s, then you may not have the family wealth or down payment help to become a homeowner today. In that way, the consequences of past redlining transcend time, even as new forms of it continue." Close quote. Hoyt, writing about the real estate industry in his day, stated the common belief that black and brown people moving into a neighborhood causes an exodus of whites and depresses property values. He was merely codifying how the real estate industry worked. According to journalist Antero Piatila in his book, Not in My Neighborhood, How Bigotry Shaped a Great American City, quote, appraisal manuals continued using the scheme well into the 1960s. Bowie sums up by arguing, quote, "Indeed, real estate racism helps illustrate the extent to which culture is built by institutions and individuals in interactions that reflect on each other. There is a stigma attached to being black when it comes to finding a place to live." This next couple of slides are Hoyt's classification and his color codes. So I'll leave this up for a minute. A recent case brought by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development clearly illustrates this reality. HUD initiated a disparate treatment complaint alleging that from 2008 to 2011, Associated Bank discriminated against African American and Hispanics. The banks engaged in discriminatory lending practices by denying mortgage loans and provision of loan services in neighborhoods with significant African American or Hispanic population, while providing such services to predominantly white tracts. The Supreme Court of the United States, in the matter of Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus Inclusive Community Project, decided essentially to validate the Fair Housing Act while clarifying the meaning of disparate impact. Yoshino explained its importance as follows, quote, "Disparate treatment requires an intent to discriminate, while disparate impact allows the plaintiff to win even in the absence of discriminatory intent." Yoshino continues by quoting from page 17 of Justice Anthony Kennedy's slip opinion, quote, "Recognition of disparate impact liability under the FHA also plays a role in uncovering discriminatory intent. It permits plaintiffs to counteract the unconscious prejudices and disguised animus that escape easy classification as disparate treatment, an idea new to the majority Supreme Court decision, according to Yoshino. The importance of awareness. We can't think about dismantling structures of institutional racism until we're aware of what these structures are. In order to combat segregation and implement the process of desegregation, leading eventually to integration, I would argue that it is important to understand just how deeply segregation is embedded into the history of the United States. It is a history that continues to play out to the present day through housing discrimination against low-income people of color. Many people confuse the terms integration and desegregation, but Dr. King was certainly aware of this distinction, arguing emphatically, the word segregation represents a system that is prohibitive. It denies the Negro equal access to schools, parks, restaurants, libraries, and the like. Desegregation is eliminative and negative, for it simply removes the legal and social prohibitions. Integration is creative and is the positive acceptance of desegregation and welcomes participation of Negroes into the total range of human activities. King, Ethical Demands for Integration, page 118. The Civil Rights Movement effectively ended Jim Crow. Segregation was declared to be illegal, and the social climate changed to such an extent that overt, obvious racism was no longer socially acceptable. Michelle Alexander advocates the development of a major social movement to put in place a new consensus to not only overturn the basic structures of the caste system, but to make sure that no new mechanisms of control rise up in replacement. Alexander posits, quote, that it is critical to build a new egalitarian racial consensus, reflecting a compassionate rather than the punitive impulse toward poor people of color, and move towards an appreciation of the distance between Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream and the ongoing nightmare, racial nightmare for those locked out of American society. Alexander, page 235. Even though King knew progress would be slower than the most optimistic people believed, he still favored an approach to ending segregation in stages, beginning with desegregation, which would lead to welcome participation and eventually full integration. The legacy that Dr. King left is the work of the active pursuit of welcome participation, integration, physical proximity, and spiritual affinity. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 has largely been a failure at curbing discrimination. Several commentators have described housing as the one area of civil rights that is most resistant to change, and the one area where the possibility of even desegregation is viewed as being remote. Johnson, page 1193. In conclusion, the segregated lived reality for all Americans is hidden in plain sight, as I've shown throughout the paper. White people live in their neighborhoods, often in gated communities, designed to make sure that no one else gets in, while black and brown Americans live in ghettos, as I previously described. I've highlighted a few of the consequences of living in such a deeply entrenched system of racial segregation. That mortgage banks in 2010 practiced redlining as defined by Homer Hoyt in 1934. Living in a segregated neighborhood has numerous consequences for people who call such places home. Previous generations have enslaved African Americans, slaughtered First Nations people, and afterwards swept the problem under the rug. In other words, they kicked the can down the road. Now the can is kicking back. It is true that I have never owned slaves, but as a white person, I believe it is my responsibility to work towards righting the wrong done to our fellow citizens, our fellow Americans. First steps on the journey to beloved community were taken many, many years ago. It is important to take heart from movements for civil rights and human rights, learn from the mistakes of the past, and move toward co-creation of beloved community. After all is said and done, and now these three remain: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Blessings to you all.
So stay right there.
Oh, I gotta stay here. That's right. I did say on Facebook you should bring your own peanut shells and rotten tomatoes and all of that. So time for you to speak up a little bit and then go ahead and have at it. Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned disparate treatment versus disparate impact. Can you give some examples of how we might see these, recognize these happening out in the real world?
You know, there is a lot of legal scholarship on disparate impact and disparate treatment, and unfortunately I haven't gotten deeply into that. But I think the critical thing in this latest Supreme Court decision is that now it is possible to take an action based on disparate impact and the question of hidden animus. And there's some other research on people like Greenwald and Banaji at Harvard have done a lot of work on hidden biases. And so that's a whole area. This opens up that whole area. Yes?
Yeah, and I think that also is kind of a windfall for you. This, in fact, somebody referred to, some media person referred to this latest Supreme Court session as the most left-wing in 20 or 30 years, and I would not say that, but this was a good decision along with the same-sex marriage decision and of course the Affordable Care decision. But it seems that I remember when we've had discussions about trying to figure out, how you would research disparate impact, how you would research disparate treatment, and how you could, because it is so hidden, and it's very hard to, there have been instances of research where a white potential buyer would go to a home with a real estate agent and get one story, and then a black potential buyer would go and they would not be allowed to buy. But it's very hard to get at, which is I think what we've been trying to do. But now with the disparate impact, it seems like it's not quite as hard to get to the because disparate impact is simply a measurement of the outcome, regardless of how it got there, regardless of the intention. It could be that the white real estate agent really wanted to sell to African Americans, but the intention is not what matters. It's the impact. So.
Right, and I think that there's, in terms of, maybe that's what I'll spend the rest of my life doing, figuring out how to research. And that would definitely be involved with hidden biases, because I think that's, once we can start talking about, the main thing for me is that we start having conversations, not only amongst ourselves, because we're the choir, but also amongst people. And there's some people doing work in this area. There's a man named Dixon White, who's an activist, good old boy from South Carolina or someplace like that. And he came to a realization that he was practicing racism without ever knowing it. I mean, I as a white person have responsibility. He has a YouTube channel and a whole bunch of stuff. But I think we need to just keep on that. And I would also think that the people in psychology and deep psychology, those people could be, I've often had it, I would love at some point in time to do collaborative research with people who are really steeped in Lacan and Foucault and those people, because I think they would help us to get at some of the underlying stuff. All the good intentions of the world. Yes, Donna.
So, first of all, thank you so much for beautiful and wonderful information. I know you opened my eyes to the idea of sundown and several years ago when we took a course. I think Lori was in that course. It's really eye-opening. As a humanities person, a literature person, I couldn't help but think of the correlation with A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry, the play where the family decides to go into a white neighborhood because that's where they could buy a place, and prices had been artificially pushed down so that white people could buy those houses, and this family decided to take advantage of that, and they were almost bought out, but decided to go ahead and go there despite threats that they would be ousted. And I wonder to what extent, you mentioned Lacan and Foucault and other humanities-based theorists, to what extent do you think that attitudes can be changed through stories, through artifacts, through exposure to other people's realities?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. And I've been very interested in storytelling because I think that, for example, can't remember the man's name, but he apologized to Congressman John Lewis for beating him up in 1953. That's about storytelling. And the woman in Georgia who was Patty Boyle. And my apologies for flipping on names, but Patty Boyle tells some very interesting stories about her upbringing as a southern white woman, and she said she had no idea that even black people wanted to be integrated until this guy Andrew Swanson sued the state to get into the University of Georgia Law School, and so she welcomed him because she's a practicing Christian, and Christians welcome people when they know the thing. So I think telling not only the heroic stories of people like Boyle and others, but also getting into the angry stories of people who are in the White Citizens Council and in the Ku Klux Klan. And if we can find any number of people, maybe in the United States there might be 1 or 2 or 5 of those people who have really been steeped in racism, who are willing to engage in some kind of a led dialogue process. I think that would be, and tell their story. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I was excited to hear that term "disguised animus" that you used, and I noticed that it came out of the Supreme Court here housing piece that just happened. My question is, how do you have any insight about how they use that term and how do they measure it, or do you have any insight about the use of it?
Could you do me a favor? I don't know if I didn't quite get your question. Would you be willing to?
Sure. It's regarding the term "disguised animus." It was.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how they measure it, or any information you have about utilization in that regard, in the way you present it. There's some legal scholarship, and particularly in critical race theorists, who are working in these areas. But I think that there's a great deal of potential in Greenwald and Bernanke, Scott Klaus. There are people who are doing work in hidden biases, and they've developed instruments that you can use to try to start to get at this stuff. But it's a very new field, and people are just now, I think, beginning to develop deeper understanding. And the other thing I didn't get a chance to mention in my presentation, but I believe contemplative traditions, such as Buddhism and other spiritual practices, have a potential for giving us the emotional tools to work ourselves out of this. We're in a box, and we need to work our way out of it.
So it seems to me that your paper presents a quandary of a sort, in that, if I understand you, you start out with a notion that beloved community is the same as, or could be described as, an integrated community. And if I look at this topic of housing, what I know from my lived experience is that many African Americans choose to live in wholly African American communities. So we know that there's a difference between wanting to live here and being forced to live here. I know there's a difference there. Am I diminishing the potential of beloved community if I choose to live in a wholly African American community? And whatever your answer is to that, suppose then you say, well, I'm simply choosing to live in a wholly white community. Is that a diminishment of beloved community?
I have thought, I've had a few,
go-rounds.
yeah, go-rounds in my own brain with this, because certainly I'm an advocate of freedom of choice, but I like the idea of freedom of choice on a tabula rasa, as opposed to freedom of choice based on my background and my upbringing. Now, maybe I'm being unrealistic, but since I'm going to take the stance of the real idealistic stance at this moment and say that I want people to be able to live where they really, really choose to live, and not base that decision on what their parents did or what their common notions are in society or whatever. And yeah, I believe there will be people who, the Italians may want to all live in, and they have, Italians in one place and Greeks in another place. But if we can all, I would like to have some places where we really interact, as opposed to being in our silos. And you talk about single issue activism. That's another whole area that people are in their little silos. They're in their racial silos, they're in their economic silos, they're in their political silos. And, I think that the rest of my life I'd like to spend trying to give people some possibility of choice in where they live. And I also want people to live in places that are free from rats and leaky roofs and asbestos. There are people in New York City, in our city, that are living in these rat-infested places that ought to be red tagged, but they're not. And that's another whole complex thing. So do you feel like I've no, I haven't. Okay, fine. I think the question is an important one, and we can keep talking about it, because I don't know that I certainly don't have all the answers. Maybe not even the right one. How about we go with Lynn, and then Carol, and then
I wanted to respond to this in particular. Could I just say one quick